In this video, we're going to be talking about the mechanisms of succession. So we talked about how specifically plant communities, but also animal communities could change over time. And we did talk about how disturbances can restart that successional process. However, those changes in plant and animal communities depend upon the ecosystem that we're talking about. And also, it's important to realize that it doesn't always have to start with one group of species, but sometimes it's just which one gets there first. So there are some mechanisms of how we see or how we believe that succession works, but we're learning new things all the time. And in fact, I'm going to include an example of one that is not in your textbook, a new one. Okay. So the first mechanism is what is referred to as facilitation. And so this is the idea that an early successional species can actually change the environment such that it becomes more hospitable for another species to take up presence and habitat and to actually increase in abundance. So an early successional species, like a weedy species, changes the environment so that it is, we'll say, more hospitable to a later or to later successional species. So a good example of this would be trees. When we look at trees, oftentimes it's the grasses that actually make the area more hospitable, more amenable to a tree taking up residence in that environment. So trees typically aren't the first species to arise in an ecosystem. Another thing that's interesting about this facilitation is that we actually believe that there are some species that are like nurse, and they call them nurse plants. So an example of this would be a nurse plant. And in the deserts, these can be really important because they provide shade, and they also keep it cooler and it's more moist. So like you could have a bush being the nurse plant, and then things can grow underneath it, and eventually they can take over that area. But it's that facilitation of that, the nurse plant facilitates the growth and reproduction of other plants. So that's kind of an interesting example, because when we're talking about the restoration of ecosystems after we have disturbed it, maybe we need to bring in recognize that nurse plants might be important, and we could bring them in and use them in ecosystem restoration. Okay. So the other one is what is referred to as tolerance. And so this is where there is a limiting factor that prevents the early successional species from persisting in the environment. So that would be where the success of a species is determined by its tolerance to a limiting factor. So the success of a species is limited by its tolerance. So there is a limiting factor. And so a good example of this would be looking at grasses that colonize after a burn. And these are actually replaced because they use up the nitrogen, and nitrogen is the limiting resource there. So the early grasses use up the nitrogen, and then they cannot survive in the low nitrogen. So other later successional species take up and are able to do well in that environment. So this one is tolerance. That's the facilitation is this one. This one has to do with tolerance to a specific factor. Like nitrogen as a limiting resource. Okay. The other one is competition. There's a third one. So we have competition. So obviously, one of the things that plants are competing for are space, but also access to light. So as things grow, they might grow up and they might shade the understory, right? So you have competition for space, light, and nutrients, for example. And so that would be an example of that, the forest shading the understory. And so that's going to limit what types of organisms can live there. We can also talk about how we have competition where plants produce chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants. And so this is what is referred to as allelopathy. So this is the production of chemicals by one plant that limits the distribution of another species. Distribution of other species. Okay, so these are generally harmful chemicals that have effect. This could also be, when we talk about coral, oftentimes coral prevent the settlement of other species by producing these toxic chemicals. And so competition is going to determine how succession progresses. Now, the one that is not in your book is kind of the opposite of competition, which is cooperation. And so this is the idea that one species aids in the settlement of another directly. It's kind of like facilitation and the nurse plants. But the example here would be in the forests, where we now know that trees are connected underground by fungal filaments, and they can actually nourish species that are different from them. So for example, the example was the fir tree can actually feed the birch trees, and the birch trees can actually feed the fir trees. And so you have this idea of cooperation. And so why we tend to see more diverse communities might be that they're aiding and they're actually feeding. The carbon is actually being captured from the atmosphere by one tree, and it's actually being passed underground to provide nutrients for another tree. And so this is another example of how we can have a mechanism that determines the change in community structure over time.